movements who were skeptical of American institutions or their promises, or were outright critical of the country's moral and sort of social order. What changed, I think, is certainly during 2020, up to the run to the 24 election, was that the establishment became progressive. It was incredibly culturally mainstream to be progressive. Academia, media, Hollywood, a lot of the big corporations all spoke with that same progressive accent in the same terms and jargon. And I think the sort of rebellious spirit of the youth flipped. The Republican Party in 24 managed to channel that, this growing anti-establishment mood and a sort of deep fatigue with what felt like a lot of cultural heaviness in the Biden years. The Biden years, for a lot of young voters, felt really stale. The president was visibly old. The economy was strained by inflation. We couldn't build things. And many young people obviously felt that their future wasn't, they weren't going to have the same opportunity as their parents, whether it's in home ownership or their economic prospects. And then you combine that with the sort of heavy cultural atmosphere, I think that you are sort of ripe for a rebellion against this sort of progressive orthodoxy that sort of set in. So I read 24 as less of an anomaly, but more of an inflection point. I don't know if it was so much great affection for the youth for Donald Trump, though he's certainly a charismatic president, as much as it was exhaustion with what had sort of become the establishment. So I read it much more as, yes, it is a story of the Democrats. It's the story of who the Democrats are and were in 2020, and the way Republicans were able to channel this sort of sense of rebellion to a lot of the cultural or economic policies pursued during that time. Obviously, predicting the future is difficult, but I still think the underlying winds are generally favorable for Republicans, though that's obviously subject to change.
Yeah. Okay, Dakota, Evan did it in the nicest way, but I think there were some shots fired there. He basically said the Democrats have become boring, and the Republicans have become the party of rebellion, the party of sort of change. You know that they have the maybe the Luke Skywalker spirit is now with them rather than with the Democrats. You work with a lot of young voters and young civic leaders on the political left, right? And so,
Yeah.
is that does that resonate with you? Does that make sense, or do you disagree?
I mean, there are some points I agree with. I think Democrats' message has become stale. It's become too out of touch with the mainstream efforts of young people across the board. Whereas like somebody like a Mandami who's coming in and disrupting an economic system that is no longer affordable has actually created a really large coalition on the left and right. And that's kind of what Trump did. Trump spoke to economic populism. But now we're also seeing a changing of tide where many young voters are dissatisfied with Donald Trump, particularly young women, right? And even though young men are more split on him as a 50-50 type ball game, young women are overwhelmingly disapproving of him. And so I think the more we go down this rabbit hole, and part of the reason I think that Democrats have a really good shot in 28 and 26 is because of the broken promises economically, where America is supposed to be put first. And then you see, whether it's 20 billion going to Argentina, now you see military families no longer getting paychecks due to a government shutdown. All this is kind of falling at Donald Trump's foot, right? And when you go out and you campaign that you're going to put America first, and you also then give foreign countries additional aid while our military is not getting paid, a lot of young men are kind of like irritated by that, I think, across the board as well, too. And so, I think Evan said it very nicely, but yeah, Democrats have a lot of shortcomings. I think Michael is on this as well, too, that there needs to be some sort of disruption of the Democratic Party to get back to advocating for working class people and really reform their platform to speak to that.
Okay, so I want to touch on the Mandani story. I want to come back
Yeah.
to that. But before we do, is this just that, as Christina mentioned at the outset, young voters don't have a lot of confidence in government now? They're frustrated, and so they're going to be against whoever's in power. And so when it was President Biden, they soured on President Biden. Now that it's President Trump again, they're starting to sour on President Trump, and they might be favorably inclined to someone who would challenge him. Micah, is this just sort of anti whoever's in office, anti incumbency?
I don't think it's anti-incumbency, but I do think it's what we've touched on, which is anti-establishment. Trump is obviously a very anti-establishment candidate. Mamdani is obviously a very anti-establishment candidate. And if you look back, I think to Obama, a lot of people forget that he was an anti-establishment candidate at the time. Like, particularly if you compare him to the Clintons, he was the guy who was like rolling up his sleeves and showing up to hip hop events and like friends with all these cool people. He was not the candidate that the Democratic Party was behind. And a lot of his messaging was very anti-establishment as well. So I think that this anti-establishment current has really been driving politics for longer than we've acknowledged, and it's going to continue to. And the Democratic Party ignores that at their peril.
Okay. So Dakota, turning back to Mamdani, when you talk to young voters who are maybe involved with the Mamdani campaign or they think he's great, what are the types of things that they're saying about him?
He's authentic. He's real. You don't get a lot of BS with him, and they like the fact that he's talking about issues that everyday New Yorkers are facing with affordability. That he is one of them. That he is relatable. He's likable. He doesn't have this elitist academia that often progressives and liberals are accused of having, right? Where it is you're more so talking down at somebody, not talking with them, right? You more so lecture people rather than to seek to understand them. I think that's one of the reasons even Joe Biden first got elected in 2020 was like he had this empathetic nature to him, where he could understand the white working class voter that has often voted Republican in rural areas, whereas not everyone gets that on the Democratic side. And without that, I think that is something that also Mandami can do, that he can talk to people about. And you see Democratic candidates who can't do that kind of like flounder in the area, or they look very authentic doing it. And so I think it's really important that people can study Mandami. Not necessarily, I don't think he's the left version of Trump, but he does have an economic populist message that really, populated with like a Bernie Sanders or AOC. But now he's taking it one step further and reaching a broader coalition in a time in where the American economy, unless you're playing in the stock market, is very volatile for you and everyday cost of living, that he's able to talk to working class people on left and right issues and be like, I want to make your city more affordable. Vote for me. And he's winning that battle.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned he's not the left analog of Donald Trump because in the New York Times this weekend there was a piece by Michael Hirshhorn that in the New York Times titled "With Mamdani, the left finally has its Trump." Now, Evan, Micah said somebody who rolls up their sleeves. Dakota said somebody who's authentic, relatable, one of them, down to earth, and they were of course describing Mamdani or President Obama. But one of the most iconic images from the 2024 campaign was President Trump working at McDonald's. And a lot of people describe him in those same words: authentic, relatable, not an elitist. How much of this was just about President Trump? How much of this is about conservatism? How much of this is about the Republican Party?
So I want to first kind of address my assessment of Mamdani and how I think conservatives are thinking about him. I
Sure.
think I would give credit to the idea that both President Trump and Zohran Mamdani represent populist politics. I think that's obvious, though I think Mamdani is an interesting case just because so much of his policies and his support comes from elites who are facing the prospects of being downwardly mobile and that they may not live off as well as their parents if they grew up in a big metropole like New York City, or they've gotten an elite college degree and they don't think that their prospects will match what that degree should confer. And I think they're more suspect to zero-sum thinking economically, at least in that regard. So I think the poor expectations of intergenerational progress are something that's certainly animating both ends of the political spectrum. But I think obviously the outcome with Mamdani is something very, very different. As to the question about Trump, I do think, I don't know if I can ascribe Trump's rise as something that's purely something based on his charisma. Obviously, Vice President Pence could not be Donald Trump, even if he said the same things as Donald Trump. Donald Trump does have, I think, some sort of intangible quality about him that makes him a leader and makes him someone that people who are throughout the country, from Middle America, from places where they don't feel like cultural spotlight is on, felt represented in. But I also read Mamdani as very charismatic, and I think his campaign managers are doing quite excellent. So to be quite honest, I don't have a precise answer as to what makes Donald Trump so special, other than I think the general direction of the Republican Party is the way to remedy what is a broken political system and what is a system that has previously yielded promises that were completely not met.
Do you think that the Republican Party has changed in a way that is appealing to Gen Z voters? Maybe wrapped up in Donald Trump, wrapped up in Trumpism, but has the philosophy changed or just the personality?
In terms of the transition from the early 2000s, or what sort of frame are we looking at here?
Let's take since 20, maybe since, but the youth vote went more Republican even over the last years. So even over the last 8 years in which Trump has been the leader of the Republican Party, has what the Republican Party stands for changed from, say, 2016 to 2024? And has that changed in a way that is more appealing to the youth vote? Or is it, the result of other things that we've been discussing and will continue to discuss?
So, two things there. I think one is that the sort of coalition that Trump's created within the Republican Party, balancing different elements, say an interventionist and more isolationist foreign policy, or a policy that's really, really skeptical of the regulatory state, but also perhaps more favorable towards a heavy-handed approach to foreign trade. I think the way he's been able to manage that and balance that, push on different points, has been really spectacular. If there's one thing about Trump, it's that he is very, very good at manipulating and holding together opposite parts of his coalition. So I do think part of it is that he can broaden his appeal to different ideas that were perhaps more fringe in past Republican administrations, presidential campaigns. But I do think, again, the big story is with the youth vote. It is the sense of rebelliousness among the youth. I think that's always animated politics. It's why they've tended to be more progressive in the past, and they're still marginally progressive. But I think the big swing was many youth voters who are in Gen Z, who are like me, said, cultural atmosphere, the political atmosphere is really, really heavy. I don't like all these cultural taboos. I don't like my economic prospects for the future. All of this is not something that I think is going in the right direction. And that's why I think they switched to the Republican Party.
Okay. So sort of, we want somebody who's fun, we want somebody who's fresh, and you guys have obviously named a few people, and of course, President Trump in part represents that to many people. Slightly changing subjects. A number of people wrote in with questions before the event, and of course, this is much discussed in the political world, but how much is this about the media ecosystem? So, Micah, I was hoping you could start there as somebody who studies how young voters get their information. Can you tell us a little bit about how young voters are getting their information? Because I think a lot of people on the left just say, well, the left needs its own Joe Rogan, and they just throw up Joe Rogan as, sort of that's new media these days. But it's much more than Joe Rogan. Where are Gen Z voters consuming news?
Yeah, it's much more than Joe Rogan. Media Matters has this great report out where they track the leading influencers, and right-leaning influencers have, I think, 9 out of 10 of the most popular podcasts and shows. So it's like we're not only in this like meta influencer space being crushed, but in like the nano smaller influencer space, like the right is just way more coordinated, and they're getting their information out and their messages out in a way that they just are not on the left. Young people, not only in terms of media, but they're disconnected from unions, from churches, from sports teams, from other civic organizations. So they're not getting their information on politics from all these different sources. Now they're mostly getting it from online and from social media. And their politics, because social media is so affect and emotion based, now their politics are being channeled through this, not being channeled through what my parents were in this union and this union told them to vote for the Democrats and they passed on that political learning to me. Now it's instead, I don't have many other sources to learn about politics. I'm getting online, I'm being pushed down this algorithm and learning about politics that way. So it's just more isolated. And that, of course, is impacting the ways that young men and young women, like specifically, are getting their information about politics. So young men, their algorithms are pushing them more towards like this pro-masculinity, anti-woke manosphere content, and young women, even though this is not entirely the case, as we have some folks on our team who are studying like young conservative Latina influencers. Young women largely are being pushed down a different path that shows them more about feminism, reproductive politics, and just like a completely different sphere. So young men and young women are just operating in completely different political worlds. So it makes a lot of sense why now this gender gap is so concentrated, particularly among Gen Z.
So let's talk about that gender gap, because
Yeah.
there's always been a bit of a gender gap in politics, but the gender
Mhm.
gap that Christina pointed out in Gen Z was massive. And it was not
Mhm.
just white men, although she noted that was the biggest category. She also noted Black men, Latino men. Why would social media be having a different political impact on men than it would be on women? If it is an emotional pitch to consumers, then wouldn't that be affecting women in the same way that it's affecting men?
Yeah. So here's the stuff that we're finding in our research. So for young men, all of this precarity, social, economic, financial that we've touched on like throughout this conversation, and this isolation and digital immersion, this makes them, we think, more susceptible to politics of grievance, and politics of masculinity. So the idea that because men are losing their place in society, and I've seen like some people in the chat put this in this as well, and because women are like gaining in a lot of indicators, rightfully so, young men have a lot of anxiety and questions about how gender works now and how they are supposed to assert their place in the world. And these algorithms are really pushing them this idea that society is rigged against them, that feminism or like DEI has taken their place in the world, and that the only alternative is to be really cynical and treat things with like meme politics. Like I think a lot of this discussion came up around the Charlie Kirk shooting. So it really pushes them down this hole of like cynicism and irony and humor. And young women, on the other hand, I think they are really drawn more to like a politics of care. So it's like institutions are collapsing. So come together, take care of each other, go to this rally, blah, blah, blah. So there's just very different paths that each group is being pushed along. And I think if you look, one of our researchers is looking at the Black manosphere in particular, and looking at how the manosphere in general, it's mostly talked about in terms of like young white men. But if you look at a lot of these algorithm holes, like there's these shows called like Fresh and Fit, and young Black men are being politicized in a really particular racialized way. So it's really important, I think, to pay attention to how specific all of this is. So yes, there's Joe Rogan who has all these followers, but there's also all these very specific influencers who are tapping into young men who like hip hop, young women who are into beauty influencers, like, and then aligning those pre-existing interests with conservative ideologies. And like, I think this report was last month that the Democratic Party is paying this group of influencers like up to $8,000 a post and like telling them what to say.
Yeah.
It's not,
Yeah,
that's not going to work.
it did not land very well, ironically, on social media. It did not land very well, as that you were trying to
Yeah.
create this rather than letting this naturally grow. But then again, I'm no political strategist. I don't know. Dakota, how is this playing out with some of the left-leaning groups that you interact with? Is it hard to recruit guys these days? Are you seeing like a 60-40 skew, women to guys? Or is this, hasn't affected the type of, you work with people who are more active, obviously, in politics. So has this not affected that world yet?
Yeah, I think on the social media thing, like the article was 8,000 a month, not 8,000 a post. Just to kind of clear that part up. But I think it is like one like what we're seeing in the field of Gen Z is they're not consuming news, right? They're absorbing narratives that are being put out there. And I think that's really important to understand. And so they trust people.
What does that mean? Help me out on that. They're not consuming news, they're consuming narratives. What does that
Right.
mean?
So instead of like actually reading an article or like going to the New York Times and reading what's happening, they're going to their favorite influencer, their favorite creator that happens to probably be on platforms like a streamer, they're a podcaster, they're on YouTube, who really fills this void of a personal connection for young people in this moment. And what they're hearing is not necessarily the news, they're hearing the narrative and what somebody's telling that from, right? And so there's a difference between if I get onto a podcast and say, well, I think what's really happening in the world is this, compared to the more objective, okay, this is what's really happening, right? And so they're observing narratives that are being put out there by their favorite influencers in this moment, right? And so how that shapes their worldview is really coming into play because they're not necessarily, and Micah studies probably show this as well too. The amount of time that they're spending on the New York Times or CNN or Fox News is very low, but how much time are they listening to their favorite streamer or podcaster on YouTube is very, very high, especially if you're a young man, right? And so what I'm articulating is that most of the podcasters out there they're not journalists. They're not newscasters. They are narrative builders. They are world builders, and that is what they're doing. They're sharing a narrative. They're not sharing the news. They may be sharing parts and bits of the news, but they're taking their own perception and their own worldview on it and presenting that out there, right? And you see that on both the left and right hand side of things right now, too. To your question about young men, I do think on the left, there is a failure to connect with young men. And a lot of that comes down to social isolation and a lack of community breakdown. I think the right and Turning Point has really shown an example of not only building online empathetic communities, but also in person. When you go to their convenings and you go to their conferences, it is not necessarily telling you how to think or what to say. They're more so building a relationship with you, right? Like you don't have to walk into a room and be afraid you're going to say something wrong because there actually is no thing wrong in the right? And I think you can kind of see that in a very small tidbit with the Politico article that came out today. Right? That is not all young Republicans, but that shows you that there is a faction of young Republicans out there who have this level of community that can dive into pro-Hitler, pro-racism, right? And so I think for us and where we have to move to as a society is one, making sure that we're condemning all that across the board. But I think for Democrats moving forward, unless they figure out how to actually build a community with young men and actually have conversations with young men, especially young men of color, that doesn't put them into a box of, oh, you just care about criminal justice or immigration, but actually understanding a lot of them are actually rooted in the financial well-being of their family and being caretakers and providers and protectors of their family. Until you have that full spectrum of like what men of color care about in 2025, I think Democrats are going to struggle to turn out young men in their favor.
So the article that Dakota referenced from Politico unveiled a number of private text messages that were sent by certain leaders within the young Republican movement that had a whole bunch of highly inflammatory comments and exchanges, including invoking Nazism, racism. Now, it should be said that they also went after the very chair of the Young Republicans. But so you can check that out if Danny just posted it in the chat and you can take a look at that. Dakota, how much of this is just we've heard so much about being woke and that maybe woke has had its moment. Is this at all about men just being fed up with wokeism, whatever, however you may define that?
You probably have some of that in there. I think a lot of it is that young men don't. Well, one, depending on where you're at as a young man, right? Like some young men, their top priority is having a child. And you do not necessarily see that being a priority of Democrats is to go have children, as well as everything it means to go take care of a child as well, too. Some of it absolutely is the wokeism and kind of the backlash from 2020, where for some young men, it was too overcorrecting in society, as well as too fast of changes for them, especially in a time in which COVID hit. And so many of them did not have the community there. And then when they were trying to get in community, they were either pushed out or felt that they were doing something wrong for not knowing the exact language or exact words they need to be using in that moment. And then also, you still have I think wokeism is not necessarily the platform of the Democratic Party. I think wokeism was pushed upon the Democratic Party. And many of these politicians, I think, lack spine to actually say what they believe in. And so they kind of just went with the first thing that they saw digitally. But I do think for most young men, it is about economic security, first and foremost, being a provider of their family. And then also, what does it mean to protect? And you also have to talk about gun rights and what that means for Democrats moving forward as well, too, because these are all things that young men care about. And Democrats often aren't speaking to them about that issue. And so I think there has to be some sort of a recombobulation, a reconfiguring of what needs to happen. But these are the top issues that we hear about from young men across the board, right? And, you can go down the list and yes, they care about healthcare. Yes, they care about climate. But overwhelmingly, most young men are talking about what does it mean to start a family, lead a family, and then economic challenges that they're facing and all the insecurity there in the economy.
So because I'm from Arizona, I'll have to say that this sounds a lot like Senator Ruben Gallego, Latino, young, recently elected to the U.S. Senate, and he very much echoed what Dakota just said and said, guys, we're not hitting with the median Democratic voter in my state. Maybe we're not hitting with the median Democratic voter in the United States, and so we are increasingly adrift or not even using the same language. Evan, we talked about some social media. Dakota mentioned connecting with a person rather than using a news story. I guess why were Republicans or the Trump campaign more successful about this in 2024? How much of this is a Charlie Kirk Turning Point USA feature, and how much of it is the broader movement?
So first on the note about obviously the late Charlie Kirk, I think obviously what he represented, which was political outreach and going to meet young voters where they were, was really, really honorable. And I do think that played a part. I think there's a lot to unpack in what was just said previously. I would say, Dakota, I agree with a lot of what you identified, though maybe from a different perspective. I would definitely extend a definition of narratives to a lot of the mainstream media. I think that's what's helped drive a lot of people to this sort of media ecosystem, this sort of decentralized media organization to hear, things that aren't being talked about by the news or are being misrepresented by mainstream outlets. But I really think what comes down to men and the change we've sort of seen in the widening gender gap, a couple of things. One, I think broadly the Democratic Party's vision for men has been be more like women. I think that's really been the cultural message there. It's that you're not really supposed to embrace masculinity or embrace, like we said, a positive vision of the future. It's much more about sort of politics of equality or things along that line. So I think that didn't necessarily resonate with a lot of male voters. Things like, these ideas of agency, for example, the idea that you have control over your own circumstances and with enough work, you can rise above and lead your family. I think that's a very masculine idea. And I think that's something that appeals to a lot of men who joined or were part of the conservative movement. I would also say the same for risk taking. That's something that applies to capitalism and beyond. But I do really think that young men were really pushed out. They were left out of the cultural movements that either identified them as sort of weak or second-class allies to the movements that the left was trying to build, or at worst, representatives of the patriarchy. And you could sort of see these odd dynamics that play out even in the dynamics of the control of the Democratic Party in their national elections, where they have very strict mandated gender quotas in their party leadership. So I do think a lot of it was about economic security. I do think a lot of it is too tough to nail down to one big causal result, but I do think a lot of it is the cultural message the Democrats have put forward over the past 8 years, as well as men's concerns about what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
Okay, so this is not going to be scientific, but I know you're in a leadership position at the Institute of Politics, and so you've presumably been a Republican for a little while, but maybe for one of your male friends who didn't identify as a Republican or just was an independent, but late in the game, he said, you know what, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Take me inside the motivations of that friend. What was he talking to you about?
So I really think it depends on the person, but I think,
Okay.
again, the big three concerns that we saw among voters was economic prospects. There was a sense that the Biden administration is not the administration for growth. It's not the administration for being better than your parents or rising above your economic station. I think the second piece was immigration. Obviously, the mass migration of people into the United States and the crime and social upheaval that comes with that. And then I think the third thing was, like I said, those cultural messages that you are not welcome in this party. And the right is wide, the right is welcoming to those, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum.
But none of that's unique to Gen Z, right? That's just how you would define anyone who maybe found the Republican Party platform appealing in 24, correct?
I would say so. I don't know if there was anything in those three priorities that was uniquely Gen Z, though I do think, obviously, because of social media, the big concern about economic prospects was probably most on everybody's mind.
Okay. Micah, in the comments and that in the chat box, a number of people have said, as an alternative hypothesis, this was about specific policy items. This is about the Democratic Party not going hard enough on environmentalism. This was about the Democratic Party having a fractured base over Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Um, is there any evidence to that? And what do you just sort of personally make of those hypotheses?
Think that we wish that that was the case, but I have seen evidence first that the issue of Gaza, Palestine was not actually a deciding factor in, or it wouldn't have been enough to tip the election in those voters who did say it was a decisive
Okay,
factor in their
because I,
vote.
if I may, just real quickly, I remember in, I don't know, it was one of the early primaries in the Democratic primary when
Mhm.
there was still a competing candidate and to Joe Biden at the time, and a number of
Mhm.
people said they're not going to vote at all if Joe Biden doesn't do better on Israel Palestine as they understood it. So you're saying that didn't translate into the general election. Those people did come home.
I think the vast majority of them
Okay.
did. I think if you look at certain segments of the population, particularly if you look at like Muslims and Arabs in Michigan, for example, there was significant drop off among those voters. And I do think for a number of very progressive voters, it was a factor. Like I know people who didn't vote because of it. But I have seen data, I wish I could pull it up right now, that suggests that that was not going to be the thing that flipped the election. And I think that this is part of the issue with Democrats is that we think it's policy. You think back to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump debating in 2016. And I remember she had, and this was my first election. This is when I was a youth. She had this website during one of the debates where she was like, go fact check all Donald Trump's claims during the election. I mean, during the debate. That's not that's not the thing
That,
that's going to tip people's
no,
politics. Like
that
is going and looking at a fact check. Politics are so driven by emotion and affect, as we've come back to in this conversation, not by rationality. Because quite frankly, if you look at studies, the Republican Party has led to demonstrably worse outcomes for people of color and for women and for the working class. However, voters from those identity groups continue to vote for them again and again and again. So if politics were all about rationality, then it would be playing out very differently. But politics are about, for lack of a better word, vibes. Like this is something that Evan said earlier. Young voters don't think that the left is cool. Like I've heard young voters describe the left as cringe and like say that the right is cool and that the right is edgy and the right is like the party that has the better vibes. Like the so to put it simply, the vibes are off in the Democratic Party, and a policy platform or a website that says, "Oh, look at all these X, Y, Z things we've done," like that's not going to do it. That's not going to be the thing that gets young voters to vote for the left again.
Okay, so I want to register Evan's displeasure. His he gave us some facial cues of his displeasure as to whether or not the Republican Party is better. I think for lower class Americans, as he phrased it, just setting that for the record. But I want to turn to Dakota, and I want to follow up, Michael. We're at a school of public policy. I'm coming to you from a school of public policy, and you're telling me that these 10-point policy plans and fact checks don't matter. So are public policy professionals doomed, and really the only people who will matter in the future are influencers and content creators and social media specialists? Is that so?
Here's a good like test to answer your question is like, can you name me four officials that were in Biden's cabinet?
Yeah.
Probably not, because they were policy wonks that were help chosen by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. But I can guarantee you that you know probably almost every single cabinet member in Trump's administration because they are on media, they're influencing, they're creating the narrative and debate out there. And so I'm not saying policy doesn't matter. I'm saying there's a certain role for policy in today's society, and it tends not to be the face in front of the camera, right? One of the things I think Democrats lost on a lot was in the 2020 primary, they tried to out policy each other when really all voters wanted in that moment was somebody to tell you, hey, you know what? I understand that you're struggling and I'm here for you, right? We didn't need Elizabeth Warren putting out the Blue New Deal to confuse people that nobody understands what it means 5 years later, right? And so I think for us and how we have to think about things is policy does matter, but influencers help translate into emotion. And what voters have been missing is this emotional connection and emotional stability. And I think the right has done a lot of good work with that, right? Whether that is Hegseth, whether that is Christie, right? The list goes on and on. Like even RFK, to some imaginable context, is creating a community of people concerned about their children's health in this moment. And even though what he is saying has been proven factually wrong in some cases, he is still building that emotional connection to say, you know what, I care that I care that your child is dealing with this. And you didn't really see that from Democratic cabinet members. And so I think Trump administration, they went out and they didn't choose the smartest people to run their cabinet. They chose the best talkers and influencers. And I'm not saying that they're stupid, right? I'm just saying that the Republicans probably have smarter people to run their departments than the people that are currently running them. Not to say that like who's running them is not, they're not smart, but I think the Republicans have great policy people who probably wrote, Project 2025 and other documents that would be more suitable if you're trying to lead with policy rather than influencing and winning the narrative battle.
So is this the new standard? Evan, Dakota's got a point that the social media game, the media presence generally of somebody like Secretary Noem or of even FBI Director Patel has been ramped up. And so, one, do you accept that they have changed the nature of some of those positions or made it a bigger priority? And then two, do you think that will simply be the expectation moving forward?
I would absolutely identify a change. I think they're definitely meeting the moment into where how people consume their news on social media is. I think as to how that continues in the future, I think it's somewhat up in the air. I mean, you've already seen Gavin Newsom's press office try to emulate
Yep.
Trump in the way they've been responding to things. So maybe the Democrats will sort of embody this new approach to politics, though I don't think it's necessarily as authentic, rightly or wrongly, as the Republicans do it. So I think it's too early to tell, but there are certainly signs that this level of engagement is doing well.
Okay, jumping back to Dakota, is Gavin Newsom, is that smart what he's doing? Some people say he's, debasing himself. Other people say, hey, we're talking about him.
Well,
And,
I
and
think
to be clear, what Evan was referencing is he's using a lot of memes. It's maybe a little more coarser. It's maybe a little more slapsticky, I guess I would say. Is that a fair
it's edgy.
characterization?
It's edgy, right? Like, here's the thing. I think Newsom is probably winning over more middle end voters and losing some of like the larger left base that's with him, right? And Newsom has always been a controversial figure for Democrats, right? Like he sways on some issues overall, but here's the thing. I think Democrats have a problem with comedy. And Democrats have a problem with humor. And that is something that the right has leaned into time and time again. And so I don't think Gavin Newsom is being serious half the time, and like his press people are not being serious on his Twitter. But Democrats have to learn how to laugh at some stuff, and I think that is going to be one of our biggest Achilles heels if we are unable to learn how to laugh at some things moving forward, and be able to lean into that satire. Right, go back to the days in which Dave Chappelle, South Park, Family Guy. We all kind of watched that stuff growing up, and now, if we turn on a 2002 episode of South Park, we'd be like, "Oh my God, this can't be on TV." And so I think there's just a cultural battle in this country. I think a lot of this comes down to is like this isn't necessarily, always just going to be Democrat versus Republican. This is where we want to stand culturally as Americans, as people living in this country, etc. And so I think Gavin Newsom is trying to be an entertainer in this moment and trying to combat Donald Trump and go head for head. But you also see that there's a reason why most Democrats are not doing that as well too, because they think it's cringe or they don't want to necessarily lose some of the base that they're doing. So, I don't know if I'm a big fan of it. I think it's like when I first saw it, I was like, is this man okay?
Yeah.
At least he's trying something in a moment in which Democrats need better messengers.
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of the social media post, but I'll admit that I'm also not a fan of Kristi Noem's I guess more aggressive social media channels.
Yeah,
And so
her,
maybe I'm just not the target
her videos
audience.
are a little insane. I don't know if you should be posting a video talking about you're going into an American city with like armed guards, right? Like at the end of the day, these are American cities that she is rampantly promoting that she wants to go target.
And look, I'm a millennial. There are generations above me who would say that you're debasing all of politics. But there are other people who push back and say, hey, we're winning in politics right now. People who might, turn their nose up at President Trump and some of his style. There are others who would say, when was the last time the Republican Party won the popular vote in the presidential election? It was 2004. So, put up or shut up sort of thing. Catherine in the comments says, can you please ask the speakers to address how attitudes may have changed given the first 9 months of the Trump presidency? So I'm going to go to Micah. The dip that Christina pointed out in approval rating among Gen Z voters of President Trump, is that a result of Dems doing better, of messages against him sticking, or is that President Trump losing a step?
I certainly don't think it's the result of the Democrats doing anything better. I think it's largely President Trump's many, many failures since he's come into office and his struggles, particularly the economic precarity that is being felt by everyone as a result of this trade war and these tariffs. I also think that while many people in Gen Z came, like these were the first political candidates that they were aware of. Like many Gen Zers, Trump was like the first big political moment for them. Some of them, I think, are willing to vote for him and continue to vote for him and still register disapproval. So I think young voters, all voters are complicated, but I still think that despite registering disapproval levels, they could still continue to vote for the Republican candidate next time. So I don't think this is any type of durable shift, at least so far. I think it's just a temporary drop in approval ratings.
Okay, and it looks like we've got a nodding head from Dakota. So you're saying that even if that approval rating continues to go down amongst Gen Z voters, if you don't put up the right messaging, if you don't put up the right candidate as a Democratic Party, then it's maybe not going to matter. I think
Yeah,
I've got nodding heads from all three of you.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And no one's winning politics at this moment, right? What we were promised with the Trump presidency was the price of groceries were going to go down, the price of living was going to go down. That's been the exact opposite of what we've seen here. Whether you think tariffs are a good or a bad thing, tariffs are raising the cost of everyday goods for Americans in this country. It's hurting farmers, especially in places like Wisconsin, where we're growing crops because we're unable to export at the same levels as well, too. Right? You can look at soybean farmers, etc. It is actually hurting some of the people that we thought he's going to be for. And so I think no one's winning. And I think at this point, unless Democrats are going to put up somebody strong, put up a strong economic message, we're going to have a lot of crisis at our hand.
Okay, I want to turn real quickly, if I may, to a poll that you guys shared with me. And the question is, moving forward, are we almost going to see two different Gen Zs that are divided along political lines? And this was the NBC, a recent NBC poll that you guys shared with me. And Gen Z voters were asked to rank the importance of 13 different life priorities. So 13 different life priorities, put them in ordinal ranking of how important they are to a successful, happy life. Among Gen Z voters who voted for Trump in 2024, having children was the most important feature of personal success. Among Gen Z women who voted for Harris in 2020, who voted for Trump in 2024, having children placed sixth. Among Gen Z men who voted for Harris in 2024, having children placed 10th of the 13 values. And among Gen Z women who voted for Harris in 2024, having children placed 12th of 13 values. So we go from first most important, having children among Gen Z men who voted for Trump, to 12th for Gen Z women who voted Harris. So are we just on two different cultural roads now, and these aren't coming back together anytime soon? Evan, I think you shared that with me first. So you want to take a whack at that?
Yeah, I think obviously it's really tough to predict the future. I think one thing that's really interesting with these trends that we're seeing is how they affect fertility and what the future of next generations might look like. Because obviously, one of the news stories that's new in the 21st century is that Republican families and Democratic families are having children at different rates, where Republicans are having more children and Democrats are having less children. So you would imagine, because families are the primary unit for political socialization, that you would have more children who will grow up in conservative families and be conservative in the future. So it may be the case that because of the trend we're seeing right now in fertility and what it means to have a meaningful life in regards to having a strong family, that it might be the case that we sort of unite in maybe the next 10, 20 years as these changes make their way. But I don't know as to how long these trends will last. I think it's too early to say.
Micah, Gen Z, a house divided forevermore?
I think I have a pretty pessimistic outlook on this, and I think it is going to be pretty divided moving forward. I think like all of the things we've talked about today, like young men not feeling like they have a place on the left in that like moral story of the left, like makes things like fatherhood and family and have a really appealing way to like restore some sense of order into the world. Like it gives them a sense of authority and identity and moral clarity. Whereas on the other hand, like for young women on the left, family and child rearing, and this is in the data, and this is also stuff I've seen like among people I know, people I've spoken to, family and marriage are seen as more ambivalent as like this poll shows. And we know there's, again, decades of social science research that suggests that women, particularly in heterosexual couples who are married and who have children, they are perform demonstrably worse on like many life outcomes. They do more unpaid labor. They have higher rates of stress and depression. So young women on the left are seeing this institutional precarity, like they see family and children as something that's like tethering them more to precarity rather than giving them this sense of freedom and fulfillment. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
All right. Because it is of vital importance to the Ash Center, which is hosting this event, and because it came up in Christina's opening presentation, I'm going to ask as the last substantive question for each of you to give 30 seconds on, is democracy doomed? Because the Gen Z perspective on democracy was pretty bleak and in government overall. So is it just we're not going to have people who believe in democracy moving forward? All right, I'll call on Dakota. Dakota, take me back from the edge.
Democracy in the republic could definitely be in doom. You can see studies that show that young people are more willing to accept authoritarian figures and have a quick decision in which they think is going to make their life better quicker rather than go through cyclical debates. And I think a lot of that is coming from the broken institutions of seeing your grandparents, your great grandparents, your mother, your dad also go through broken systems. And so I think unless we actually can show that democracy is a way in which to have a debate amongst people to make policy better, to improve the lives of people, we're going to probably fall into more authoritarian regimes where quicker decisions are made without as many people happening. And so I think it's really up to us and people who are believers of democracy to show tangibly that democracy can improve lives and not just talk about it as being a concept and a way of life, but actually show how does it reduce your cost, how does it make life more affordable for you, how does it make your children's life better, how does it make education better, etc.
Okay, so Dakota, democracy's a little bit in trouble. We got to show that it works if we want people to believe in it. Evan, how's democracy and government trust not very high for Gen Z voters? Is it going to get better?
I think it's too early to say, to be quite honest with you. I'm not a complete doomer for our republic. I'm a big believer in the American experiment. I think it's the greatest form of government that's ever existed on the planet Earth. But that said, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. That's John Adams. From the get-go, we've had this sense that our republic is precarious, and it's not something that we're going to keep if we can't maintain it with the right civic, social, and political order. So I'm hopeful that the American experiment can last, but there are a lot of forces at play that might cause it to veer off the edge.
Okay. Evan invokes John Adams. A democratic form of government is meant for a moral people that has to be involved. So the people have got to really step up here. Micah.
I would say I don't think democracy is doomed because I don't think this country has ever been a functioning democracy. So I think it is possible one day for this country to be a democracy. And but do I think it's likely? At this moment, no. But I, in the tradition of Ella Baker, also like think that we have to just continue organizing and bringing people together in the hopes that one day that will be achieved. I don't think any of us on this call will probably ever see the US achieve a full democracy, but I'm hopeful that generations in the future will.
Okay, Micah took me a step back, but maybe gave me a path forward to take future steps forward in the future. Okay, so I'm going to read off a comment from Shika, which is, I find this conversation the smartest convo I've heard in a long time. Thank you. Your panelists are excellent. So by far the best comment. Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. And thank you very much to our three panelists, Evan, Micah, and Dakota. You can follow them on social media. You can, again, go pull up their bios that were up at the top. We really appreciate their presence here. I also want to thank Danny and Melissa, the events team at ASH, who put this together. Be sure to check out the ASH Center website for future events. We have a lot of events like this. I think they're all very enjoyable. Hopefully you'll check out a few. And then lastly, I want to say thanks to Tova Wang, who heads up our studies in this specific area and is really the person that put this panel all together. And for other studies that Tova commissions and writes herself, please again go to the ASH Center website. Thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. We appreciate your time. And again, we will make the link available for the recording. We'll send it to you by email. I'm Stephen Richard.